All right. Well, thank you for coming. My name is Glenoic, and this is V Input Output, Dr. No, and OmniGamer. And we're here to talk about speedrunning and research, and kind of how speedrunning, what the works that we do in speedrunning outside of just playing the game, and here at GDQ. I'm actually quite excited for this panel because we've each done speedrunning work at different stages in academia and schooling, and outside of school too. So really quickly, I'm going to go over a really quick kind of overview of what work has been done, and then I have some pre-prepared questions to ask all of us to kind of get the conversation going. And at the end, if you have any questions, we'd be more than happy to answer your questions. If it's for one of us or all of us, I think I would like most of the discussion to be between the audience and us. So first, the work that has been done. The earliest work that I can find of actually published speedrunning work. So by published, I mean work that has been written and reviewed and kind of presented in a very formal manner rather than just articles you write on the web. The earliest is in 2014, and it was a master's thesis, and the most recent one is just last month, I believe, by Dr. No right here. So it's still ongoing, it's still very recent, and there's still more work being done. And in total, I found five master's theses throughout the years, 3 peer-reviewed academic journals, 1 conference proceeding, which is kind of more academic, and you have to go and present and all sorts of fancy shenanigans. And the fields that it crosses includes game studies, communications, media studies, education, arts, and human-computer interaction. So these are kind of the fields that work has been done. And there's been 2 books published, one by OmniGamer, one by, I think it's David Snyder, on interviews with speedrunners. So that's kind of a really quick overview of the work that has been done. And you can see there's not too much, and it's been growing in the past few years, which is why we're very excited to be sharing our work and see where all of this goes. So to start off, I'm going to go through from your left side and down to give an introduction of who we are, the work that we do in speedrunning, and how we actually got started. A small story of kind of how we got into doing work outside of just playing the game.
Okay. My name is Vi. I go by V Input Output on Twitch. Some relevant info about me: I've attended the State University of New York at Fredonia on and off since 2015, and I am currently majoring in computer science, specifically software development, and philosophy there. I got into speedrunning at around the same time at the end of 2016. And I became very interested in the philosophy of play. So my field is very much the building blocks of what makes a speedrun, how does it relate to games and play in general, and that's pretty much it.
Okay. So I'm Dr. No. I'm not a doctor. That's why I have the name. I attended Ball State for my undergrad in public relations. It was very much not a theoretical focus. It was way more applicable for work in a PR field. I actually got a job at the University of Southern Indiana, which has a Master of Arts in Communication program, which I had always wanted to pursue. I got more involved in the Kaizo ROM hacking community around the same time as I started my master's degree, and I found myself asking a lot of the same questions about what people were talking about advertising, when people were talking about media, television, stuff like that. I found myself asking a lot of the same questions about speedrunning and about specifically GDQs. And so, as you see, I actually did my master's thesis on the relationship that community members have with each other and with the games they play, specifically focusing on the Kaizo SMW community because that's the community I'm involved in. Both my interest in the academics and my interest in speedrunning have kind of grown together, and they're kind of hard to separate at this point. But it's been a really cool journey, and it's basically just started from having the opportunity to ask some questions that no one really knew the answers to.
So I'm Glenoic. I'm currently attending Indiana University at Bloomington, doing a PhD in informatics, and a lot of my research is looking into speedrunning. And how it got started was, originally I was interested in doing research in robotics and social cues. And during my interview for the PhD program, they asked me, so what are you interested in? I said, oh, robotics and social cues. And they said, okay, cool. What are you really interested in? And I told them, well, do you know what speedrunning is? And I've been founding since 2013, 2014. And when I told them what it is, they said, I think we have a faculty here that might be interested in working on this with you. And it took me as complete surprise, and sure enough, I got matched with a faculty member as my advisor who did video gaming research, and he said, sure, yeah, let's see where this can go. So about a year and a half worth of work, we eventually wrote a paper and published it. You could take a look afterwards if you want. And it was actually pretty well received by the larger academic community when I went to a conference. So that's kind of how it got started. And it was more of seeing who was interested, and almost by accident, someone was interested in doing a speedrunning work at a PhD level. So that was really, really exciting for me. And specifically, I look at the intersection of live streaming, charity, speedrunning, and looking at how the runner, the couch, the viewer, the hosts, and the audience interact with each other over the technology medium, and how that helps generate donations.
All right, and I'm OmniGamer. I've been a practicing speedrunner since 2011 or thereabouts. My background on the academic side, I have masters in computer engineering and cyber operations, which leads to some fun, kind of unique skills that I get to apply towards speedrunning. But my main focus has been kind of as I've gone through, tried to go through route games, investigate them, come up with better ways to optimize play, is actually looking at the process, analyzing, well, what is a good generalizable approach that you can put across any game and start to basically refine it and optimize it, and kind of look into the optimization studies from there. More recently, just earlier this year, I published Speedrun Science, which is the first speedrunning textbook of sorts, and that's been received pretty well. And I also had some nice, unique opportunities for outreach with a talk at Google last year, and that's available on YouTube.
Fun fact, I actually cited OmniGamer's book in my thesis proposal.
Yeah. I also want to ask a question. So how did we get from speedrunning just as a hobby or like a backup man idea to actually pursuing it in actuality and getting academic work done? So for me, when I first got into the PhD program, I actually didn't start doing speedrunning work right away. I actually worked on another project on esports casting with another colleague of mine. And that also took about a year. And during that year, I worked with my advisor to formulate a research question, formulate a research plan, did some preliminary kind of work. And that took about a year before we were at a point where we said, okay, let's actually develop, allocate a lot of time and put this as a full project. So that kind of early stages took about a year before we decided, yeah, I think this is something we can do. I'm curious, how did the rest of us go from just an idea to planning to executing research in speedrunning?
Well, for me, I don't want to say it was accidental, but it was very much not like you. It was not what I started out. I didn't start my comm program determined to do my thesis on speedrunning or Kaizo. It just happened to come out that way. And I think what really started it for me was taking a class on computer-mediated communication and reading a lot of the work of reading some scholarly works and some theories, and having conversations as a class about, how this theory applies in, everyday life today, the things you do in grad school, that kind of stuff. And I found myself asking, wait, like, if we're talking about this subject here, I have this exact same question about speedrunning and about, ROM hacking. Why, like, these questions answer these questions lead to these other questions, and I found myself kind of diving into an academic rabbit hole that eventually led to me being able to say, I think there's enough here that I can do my full thesis on this. And thank God, I had an advisor who was open-minded enough to listen. Not everyone has that opportunity, but they didn't necessarily understand speedrunning. They didn't necessarily understand video games, but they were willing to hear me out. And when they heard my questions, they knew how to answer those types of questions. And that was really the key that unlocked this whole project, was finding a faculty member that could listen to me kind of talk out loud and ask these questions out loud and say, here's how you can find answers to these questions. And that's really what started me going down that path.
For me, it's more difficult for me to say because I haven't done much formal research as of yet, but I'm still very much in that earlier state where I am trying to find something that I can pursue to relate speedrunning to something more traditionally already studied. For my example, it would be, again, the traditional ideas of what makes a game, what makes a good game, what makes a game different from a sport, those sorts of questions that have been answered in a traditional sense with relation to, say, board games and other forms of play that have been around for much longer than video games.
Yeah, and I think just the common theme amongst how we've discussed it before and how we will probably continue to do things is that in general, you don't try to force speedrunning into something else. It's you start down a path, you start to see here's the formal way that this has been, that a particular field has been accomplished through the many years, and then you see how that actually applies towards speedrunning. You don't try to start with speedrunning and say, how can I apply it to this? And really, it's that speedrunning by itself is not some entity in a bubble. It is something that is just a composition of a lot of different factors of human enjoyment. And as you go through your normal studies, you find something that you like, you can apply that back towards speedrunning when you start to see the parallels as you learn more and more about your field.
All right. Next question I want to ask each of us is the challenges that we faced. So when I first started formulating a research question, I originally wanted to do something with speedrunning and kind of how people go along learning how to speedrun and the resources that they have and the community discussions. And then there was talk about looking at the verification process of a run being verified by community members. And eventually, the research question that we settled with was, how does GDQ generate so much money for donations? And the reason is because speedrunning is rather niche and very, very new, that we could anticipate when we submitted our paper for anonymous review that our reviewers will have no idea what speedrunning is. So our pitch was, here's the charity work that speedrunning does, here's the number, here's millions of dollars to get the older academic understanding that, oh, this is significant, and then bring in speedrunning. And that was a really big challenge because I was very reluctant because I wanted to focus purely on speedrunning. And my advisor said, if you focus purely on speedrunning, your reviewers are not going to be interested at all because they're going to be so lost and they don't know why this is important. So that was a really big struggle I faced trying to have enough speedrunning and also match it with the academic interests that the reviewers or the larger community will be interested. And I had to let go of, okay, let's not focus so much on speedrunning, let's also focus on charity and live streaming technologies. And it was a little bit hard to do for me.
I had some issues. I'm just going to talk about kind of part of the process for making the book, and it's actually kind of the generational changes in how information was preserved. And part of that was I was collecting information on history, who was accomplishing these things, who had such and such runs. And actually earlier on, a lot of that information is more concrete because you have forum posts, you have videos that are recorded and saved on archive.org and so on. And it's kind of funny, in the middle, after about 2013, 2014 or so, you start to have this much more disparate placement of information. People start to kind of set up their own smaller communities where they just talk amongst themselves. They kind of share information, but if you're not part of that bubble, then you miss out. And it actually changed up a little bit who I needed to talk to, how I was able to grab that information, and that's kind of an interesting piece that just kind of shows how a lot of the cultural aspects of even trying to share information on runs is changing as technology changes, as people have more conveniences and other shifts with communication.
I think for me, one of the biggest challenges was answering the question that I got a lot, which is, so what? Which is shockingly a very important question that you need to know the answer to if you want to do academic research. Because if you don't have a good answer for so what, people aren't going to support your project. Contrary to some popular belief, academic research happens for a reason, and that reason is because people want progress or people want to expand useful knowledge available. And trying to explain what I was trying to do to people, and then their initial question was, okay, well, why does this matter? Like, why does this matter to this field? Or how are we as scholars going to be better off and be smarter because of the research you're going to do? Answering that question, well, is very hard. No matter how much you love speedrunning and no matter how much you care about the people that do it, that's a hard question to answer, and that's a hard question to answer in a way that satisfies people that don't know anything about it. And big numbers help, relating it to things that people can understand helps. But if you're not able to go in and on someone else's terms explain why what you care about is important and why they should care about it too, you're gonna have a really hard time not doing your research, but doing anything with your research. And unfortunately, especially with grad school, that's a big part of it, because most classes won't care if what you do for them doesn't really leave the classroom in terms of like publishing or conference presentation or anything like that. But the second you start trying to do something with it beyond just use it in a classroom, you're gonna have to start justifying your work in a whole new way. And for me, one of the biggest challenges I faced was learning how to justify my work and learning how to justify this research in a way that resonated and got the attention of people who were either predisposed or completely ambivalent to the topic in the first place.
Yeah, another really quick one is, while I was doing research and reading up on literature, there was a paper that was published in 2018 by Freeman and Wan looking at why people donated to individual live streamers. And my advisor said, well, someone already looked at why people donate to live streamers. What's your research going to bring in new things to contribute? Because we can't just ignore and not cite them because it's already out there and they're really well known. So I spent a good month or two trying to figure out, well, how is my work different from the existing work? And how am I building off of their work? And that was really, really tough, making sure that what I'm doing is new enough that people will care, and at the same time still building off of their work, because then it's not just a complete copy, or people don't read it as a complete copy.
Something else to just quickly add on to that is there's another set of questions called the Hale-Meyer Catechism that is commonly used in various types of research, but it's essentially a set of questions that you should ask yourself before you go in and make any kind of research pitch that discusses going through just your own reasoning and why you think that this is going to be important, who's it's going to affect, and so on. So that's certainly something to look at any time that you're going to be pitching any kind of research, let alone something speedrunning oriented that might have a lesser audience.
All right. My biggest problem that I've faced, even in informal research, has been just the glut of different routes and pursuits that you can go down with regards to the questions you can ask. I did a panel last AGDQ on the philosophy of speedrunning, which, as you can imagine, is a very general topic, and I tried to cover quite a bit in that panel, as Darkman and the people who recorded last time can attest. One of the specific topics that I got to was why certain rules for different runs and different categories of games are the way they are, and if there's any universal rules or if there are no universal rules. Even that specific subject, there is so many speedrunning communities that you can take evidence from, much of which can contradict other evidence that you can find, that you can expound upon that for, it could have taken up the whole panel length by itself. So just trying to hone in on a specific area of study, I guess, has been in itself quite a difficulty, and it's likely going to continue to be a difficulty.
Yeah.
Yeah, and not just the amount of avenues you can take, speedrunning kind of ideas and questions, but the amount of other related work that you should bring in. So with just, what rules are accepted are the universal rules. There are, theories in communities of practice. There's Kuhnian theory. There's theories of practice that you can apply. And once you start reading, you start realizing, oh, there's all of these other really older fields that really are interesting, and you don't know which one to take down. And it's just, your brain starts hurting keeping track of everything you've read. And I think that is a really, really big challenge to do, to figure out where to take it and what to apply to it. And it's just, your brain starts hurting.
One of the hardest things that I had to face was when I had to go to a professor or go to a member of my committee with something that I'd written that said, very little has been written on this topic. And every time I said that, they seemed to take it as a personal challenge. And every time they were like, well, what about these 12 papers that I found in like this, 12-second Google search? And I'm like, where did you find those? And a lot of them didn't have anything to do with the topic that I was talking about at first, but it contained information that was relevant to answering my question. And there, even as Glenn kind of showed, as a topic for papers and presentations, there's not that much out there right now. But as OmniGamer said, there is so much that makes up speedrunning, and each individual component of it has been so thoroughly researched.
Yeah.
Like the idea of play, as Vi was saying, goes back centuries.
Absolutely.
So just because there isn't an answer to your question out there necessarily doesn't mean that people haven't tackled parts of it. And finding and gathering all of that information turned out to be a whole lot harder than I thought it would be.
Yeah. Let's move on. If you have questions, keep it in mind. And we're going to have an open Q&A later. What has been most rewarding doing speedrunning research? Because it's a little bit of a niche thing to do, and some people might see it as, well, why not just keep it as a hobby? I think for me, it's the reason why I organized this panel is because when I started doing research in speedrunning, so many people were interested and gave me support. Like, oh, this is really interesting. The work you're doing is I'm really fascinated in it. And not just the people I meet at GDQ, but also people at conferences and my colleagues. I have colleagues doing the fighting game community research and research on esports casting, research on toxicity in gaming. And they were all saying, this is a good topic to go through and look at. And that kind of support from all sorts of populations and different fields has been really, really supportive and rewarding to know that, the work I do, people find interesting.
I think for me, it was almost the opposite. Speedrunning wasn't a hobby when I started this. It was something I knew about. It was something I watched to pass the time necessarily, sometimes, not always. But the most rewarding experience for me was getting introduced to this community as a whole and to the Mario community, specifically to me. Many of you know how awesome your communities are. I didn't until I started researching one. And the more I researched one, the more I started getting involved with it. And the more I started getting involved with it, the more I became part of it. And now I'm doing things that I would never have thought I'd be able to do, before I started doing research. And it's all stuff in this community. So I don't want to say came into the community through a different door, but my introduction to the community is probably the single most rewarding experience for this research for me. I'm not saying that's what everyone's goal should be, but for me, that's how it worked out. Like, I started out passionate about a topic, and by the end of it, I became passionate about the people that were involved with that topic. And for me, that's by far the most rewarding experience I've had.
For me, it's definitely the collaborative aspect. I was almost overwhelmed by the number of people who came to me after my panel last AGDQ who said, hey, I really found this specific idea fascinating. Can I meet up with you to expound upon it a little bit? And that collaborative energy, when you get to experience it, is just a joy.
Yeah, I booked a lunch meeting with you.
Right.
To talk more.
The most rewarding thing for me is obviously book royalties. But seriously, the main thing is I tried to go through as much of my own experience, just starting out as a fledgling runner, taking it up through a number of different games across a number of different genres, and then realizing here is this process that is kind of intuitive to me. Coming from an engineering background, there's all sorts of ways of optimization study that I had encountered in school that, whether I realized it or not, I was applying towards playing. And then finding entire just swaths of people who are like, oh, I love speedrunning. I want to get in there and I want to get started right away, and I have no idea how to do it. And just that I could even provide some kind of discourse, some kind of just guidelines on, all right, well, if you want to get involved, here's some steps for you. If you get stuck or there's something like really bugging you and you want to find out, here's a process that you can use that'll take you through. It'll introduce you to something in the game. You'll be able to find out something that you might not realize is even possible. And just that aspect of things is really valuable to me, is that allowing people to realize that a lot of these things that runners have spent years and years trying to perfect and figure out and do is not something that is unique or a special skill. It's something that you grow and you find as you look into and find the ways that other people have done it before. And just being able to provide that has been really, really feels good.
I just want to second that, because even having been a speedrunner for a few years before Omni's book came out, having read it, it helped me a lot to have these sort of ideas come into conscious knowledge that I had been doing subconsciously for a while. And I think that is what a lot of people pursue research into these subjects is to do, is to bring to knowledge something that people kind of understand but haven't put into words or explained sufficiently yet.
Yeah, I remember, I think last AGDQ, I did a panel on commentary practices and relation to storytelling and esports casting practices. And the YouTube archive, someone wrote, this is already obvious. And I'm like, exactly, like this should be obvious. It should be something groundbreaking, but not many people think about it this way, and that's the whole idea. So lastly, I'm actually going to combine the last two questions, which is future directions for speedrunning research and future ideas, and also advice for anyone who wants to get started or start thinking about doing research and speedrunning. And OmniGamer touched upon this earlier, but and we were discussing this earlier, but the biggest advice I think we can all agree on is don't go into it thinking, I want to do speedrunning for my master's, I want to do speedrunning for my PhD, or I want to do speedrunning for a book. But it's more of you want to go into a field that you're interested in and see how speedrunning can relate to it. If you put speedrunning first, it seems a little bit counterintuitive, your biggest passion, your biggest interests, then you don't really leave the space to connect to these existing fields of academics and art or engineering or in communications or in media studies. So don't force it. Don't force, I want to do speedrunning first. I'm sure there's a different way to word it, so I kind of want to leave it for the others to kind of talk more about this.
I think the best way I could say it is if you're not willing to sacrifice how much you love speedrunning to study it, don't study it. Because there's a very good chance that by diving into it as deep as you need to do in order to do this kind of stuff, you risk a lot of burnout. You risk a lot of your personal passion for it fading as it becomes work and not a hobby.
Yeah. To give you an idea of the amount of time, for this project, for published paper, was a year in planning, a year and a half, a year of data collection and analysis, and then throughout that year was another overlapped year of writing. So total took about 2.5 years, and I have 2.5 more years to go for my degree. So it's a marathon. It's a long journey. So if you push the passion too much, you're going to burn out, and it's going to really destroy your interest in speedrunning. Yeah.
As an aside, I'll point out that that's good advice in general, even if you're in academia right now and you aren't pursuing anything relating to speedrunning. I know I have multiple friends just within the past year who kind of entered a graduate degree because they finished their bachelor's and weren't sure what to do as far as pursuing a career or didn't want to enter the field right away and thought, well, I'm interested in this subject. I will try and study it professionally, and ended up dropping out because, again, if you approach it with that kind of attitude in mind, you probably will burn yourself out on whatever subject you choose.
I mean, Omni, you spent 5 years on your book.
Is it
Why are you
something
still
like that?
here? How did you not burn out?
Lots of breaks. Certainly, there were times when I would just fire up a stream. It's just like taking writing break. I found a new game, and I'm going to play through it. And, oh, well, it's really fun, so maybe I'm going to play for a few more days. And just that kind of, it was a necessary thing to kind of bring me back into the real world. And it's just like, oh, I finished up this section. I'll reward myself with a little bit of free time. And then, oh, well, I found a new game that I want to speedrun, and I'm thinking about it a little bit more, and oh, I can write up a section about this. That's really cool. Yeah, don't burn out. There's other things that you can do, and really your subconscious is really good at still kind of grinding away on problems in the background, even when it's not your focus. The other thing that I wanted to mention is just with the future directions for research and speedrunning is that there's a lot of it. I'm sure all of us have talked to a variety of scholars who are currently working on other speedrunning related topics around the world. And really, there's so much out there that is finding its own way, especially as streaming culture becomes larger. We have more opportunities to kind of show off this craft to a mainstream audience. As that gets more and more exposure, it'll be more and more studied, and we'll get to some pretty significant new ideas coming out from it, I'm sure.
I really think that is the future of scholarship when it comes to speedrunning, is not actually speedrunning itself, but speedrunning as content, speedrunning as media, and speedrunning as something that we watch other people do as opposed to do it ourselves. As streaming becomes more and more of a dominant way of people consuming their content and people broadcasting their content, I think you're going to see, and you're starting to see it now with, the platform wars where, streamers are starting to move around because platforms are offering them opportunities in the form of dollars and other incentives. And you're starting to see streaming behave a little bit like traditional media, like television. And media scholars don't necessarily understand that yet because they're not paying attention to the new stuff. They're focusing on what they're used to and what they know. So the opportunities for speedrunning people and for speedrunning scholars is to be on the latest cutting edge of where people are consuming this media. Because if you think about it, if there was a TV show in America that got 100,000 viewers over the course of 24 hours straight for 7 straight days, people would study it if it were a television show. Well, we have that here this week, and not a lot of people are talking about it. And the chances we have to talk about it are going to be the chances we have going forward. And as individuals keep growing, it's going to be the same thing.
Yeah. And other ideas off the top of your head, off the top of my head, is speedrunning in relation to cybersecurity and hackers. Speedrunning as how people collaborate over long distances at a very rapid pace. Controversial, speedrunning as an esports. I shouldn't bring that up here. But yeah, so there's a lot of different areas you can take it. And I think with this, I want to open the floor up to questions for anyone.
You had something.
You have something to add?
Okay.
So if you have questions, please do ask, and we would love to continue the discussion.
There's a microphone over here.
Something I've noticed at AGDQ, I think one of the youngest runners, I forget his name. I'm really bad at those. But they did run Sonic 06 Silver Story. I can confirm that. Focus. It's Focus. Thank you. They started speedrunning at a extremely early age, in my opinion. Thank you. Again, 12. I like you. We got backup. my thoughts to that are, what are your ideas and opinions for someone where what you believe would be the truly best age for someone to, say, go into speedrunning versus an age that is too early? Because this is me, and I'm kind of crazy. I'm not fully studied, but I do have crazy psychological thoughts, not suicidal or murderous. But but how people interact, because growing up, I was a social outcast. So when I see someone who focuses so heavily on one aspect, it worries me. I guess my question is there an age where speedrunning is too early and affects someone's social life?
So off the top of my head is speedrunning and its relation to esport. So professional esports players, I think earliest age might be 13. I think a lot of tournaments have like minimum age as 13. I think for good reason. One, during that age, you're developing really fine motor skills, and as you grow, it's like any sport you play, you can refine, and your reaction speeds are very sharp. And the prime age for esports players, I think, is around their 20s. By the time they hit the 30s, their reaction speed or their endurance isn't good enough that they should just be team captain or a coach. But I think the dangers is my bigger worry for speedrunning or playing video games professionally early on is the addiction it can cause when your brain is still very young and still very plastic. That if you play so much of one thing that it becomes your source of sense of achievement or gratification. That I think is the biggest worry that I have that I can think of.
Just from personal experience, so in another life, I did competitive Super Smash Brothers Melee stuff. I started that at around 14, but I had a younger brother, 4 or 5 years below me, and he basically would keep up and travel to tournaments with us. And so at 11, he was going around and beating moderately significant players in the community. That's not unheard of. There's a lot of very young players nowadays who travel to tournaments with their parents because they need a legal guardian with them at all times. But there's something about being young enough that I can't really talk to the developmental pieces, but that is the age at which there's a lot of kind of competitive feelings. You want to be known, you want to be special for something, but it's also the point at which you do start to have enough of the elementary ground covered. So you kind of know the processes, you can think through what an opponent might do, for example, and it's when you can start to contemplate those sorts of things. But that's still kind of the early teens region at which that's effective, as I would say.
I'm coming at it from a different perspective, A, because that's not my field of scholarship, and B, because my community doesn't necessarily focus so much on speed as it does on just general achievement at times. And we have people in our community that are 13, 14 years old that are doing things that people that have been playing this game for decades are just now trying to do themselves. But for me, it's less about the physical and it's about the mental. And I think you would probably have some stuff on this as well, because speedrunning a game, you're doing something very different than playing the game. If you're playing a game for the first time just as a playthrough, you're taking note of the story, you care about the characters, you're like, oh, this is a very well-designed video game. You know, I'm enjoying this experience. If you're speedrunning that game, none of that stuff matters at all. You're playing a game for a very different reason than someone that's just playing a game casually. That doesn't mean that reason isn't valid, and that doesn't mean that reason isn't healthy. It's just a different reason. You're playing a game for a different outcome than someone else would. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a reason for concern. Now, if someone's, it's trying to play basketball by just throwing the basketball at someone's face over and over again, that's different. But if your goal in playing a game is, I don't really care about the characters in this game, I don't care about the setting, I just want to beat this game, and I want to beat it faster, and I want to be better at it over and over and over again. That's not what the developers intended. That's not what the game was made for. but it's a perfectly valid reason to play the game. And it's, to me, if that's truly the person's motive, I don't think it's anything to be concerned about.
For me, to put what you said in philosophical terms, it would be when you're speedrunning, you're taking strictly a illusory attitude towards a video game. Whereas if you're playing it through to enjoy the story or to experience the dialogue and characters, as you said, you're taking more of an artistic attitude towards the game. Other than that, to respond to your question, I would say my biggest concern, Klenoic mentioned one of your friends has done work on toxicity in the esports community. So I would, personally, my thought would be how that relates to age differences in those communities.
Yeah,
And how the dynamic differs as the age differs.
Yeah, my colleagues actually published a paper called "You're Not My Rival, You're an Asshole," which is, I think, the best title to a paper. But I think that's my response. Yeah.
I think the only other thing I'd say is it depends on the game, because I think speedrunning a 2D platformer may be a little bit different for a 12-year-old than speedrunning Dark Souls, just in terms of content and tone. But again, there is no, in my opinion, there's no invalid way to play something, as long as what you're trying to do is truly play for enjoyment and not for ulterior motive.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Oh.
Well, okay, so the question, or maybe just questions that I have, actually comes from several interactions that I've had with my friend GlitchCat, who several of you may know. And it has to do with this shift that's happened over time in terms of competitive video gaming and how what used to be the norm in terms of what competitiveness was in terms of high scores, and people would, you know, grind these games for hours on end to try to see if the highest score that they can get. And now over time, it seems like there's been this shift from the high score runs to, you know, now trying to optimize it for speed. And I'm wondering if any of you have, you know, any thoughts you can give on why that shift happened over time, and what could have, you know, changed in the cultural setting for video games to allow for, you know, one of these things to start taking the lead in terms of that.
I actually want to add an addendum to that question and pose it to OmniGamer,
Yeah.
which is how much is Twin Galaxies at fault for a lot of this shift?
Yes.
Well, having not been a part of that community, it's hard to say. It's a lot of just observing from the outside, but there's a lot of different factors at play here. The types of games that people play have changed. We've moved from an arcade-centric gaming medium to a home-based gaming medium. There's just the amount of content in a game has changed significantly, even in the last 10 years or so. You're playing games that actually have a developed story. You have things like cutscenes. Like, it doesn't play in as well to a score-focused completion. And on that side, time is something that can be applied equally across any medium, so long as you have a point at which you can start and a goal. So as long as you have those things available, then you can easily set up a run. You can define your incremental improvements. And the thing with time is that you get diminishing returns for every level of ability that you improve. So it's very hard to actually determine, like, this is the best possible time. Whereas in a score, if you find a way to max out the score and you get all 9s, well, that's kind of the end of the road. There's an upper limit to score where there may not be a lower limit for speed, at least one that is easily defined.
Yeah. Two things I want to add is, one, that kind of research question is a more historical avenue, which exists. I have a colleague doing video game history, looking at how space games has changed and defined video gaming. David Snyder's book, Speedrunning: Interviews with the Fastest Gamers, I think is the title, did a wonderful documentation of the move from arcade games to the rise of Doom to segmented runs to single runs. So that's a terrific resource if you're interested in the history. And the last thing is, as OmniGamer said, it depends on what people are playing. So in the early days, it was arcade games, it was high score based. Now it's, then in the, when consoles came out with cartridges and CDs, so, well, we can beat this game. And now with the rise of, Overwatch and multiplayer games online and Fortnite, we're kind of coming back to high scores because, for example, in Overwatch, the PvE events, there's high score based or time based. And so to answer your question, we might see a shift into another type of speedrunning spirited practice. It depends on what the larger community is interested in playing and where the people are gathering to optimize gameplay, whether it's score or time.
Yeah, I don't have much to add because I don't want to speak for Omni pretty much, but in his book, he points out that you can define a speedrun as one type of challenge runs of a game, of which high score runs would be a different type of challenge run. So it can help to frame it in that mindset. And then as for the social shift from high score runs to speedrunning, again, what they said.
Yeah.
I think the other thing is with a high score run, the goal is it's different in terms of, yes, there's the upper limit, but it's also different from a mentality perspective. With a speed run, the approach is almost communal in the sense that, yes, one person sits down and logs a time, but the community isn't sitting around, holding on to their strats anymore. Like, this is truly us against the game. It's not us against me, against you, against you, against you, and the game is our battleground. The real fight isn't between the different players, it's between the players and the game to try and get the best time possible. High score doesn't have that connotation. There's no communal group coming together to try and get the kill screen on Pac-Man because it's a fixed point. You just have to get it. And it's way more competitive in that sense that there is a fixed target. Whereas with speedrunning, it's way more, how can we do this? Yeah. Not how can I do this? Because one of the first things people do nowadays if they're going to be streaming a speedrun, which makes it kind of hard to hide your strats, first of all, but they're going to be sharing skips, they're sharing strats, they're sharing within their communities the techniques and the tricks to help lower the time for everyone, not just for themselves. And I think that social shift, there's a whole bunch of reasons you could look at that just in society, and generational stuff that, you could, theorize out loud if you wanted to. But I think a big part of it is that the communities view their game as a shared problem to solve, not as a platform to compete on.
Yeah, but that's definitely a valid historical research question, or even anthropological avenue to take it. But yeah, terrific.
Got a question about peer review. So my experience with review, my personal experience has mainly been with taskvideos.org, and they evaluate videos on a forum. People contribute posts and add comments, and then a team of judges decides whether to accept or reject the run. It's not unlike scientific peer review, where you have people making recommendations to an editor who decides whether to accept or reject. I know other speedrunning communities do it differently. So my question is, what can speedrunning communities and academic communities learn from each other in the area of peer review?
Go ahead.
Just one of the things I wanted to talk about earlier, didn't quite get a chance to, is that speedrunning is already a very academic-like pursuit. It is just much more informal than you'd expect at a typical conference flow or otherwise. So everybody is sharing, whether it's on some game Discord or through ancient forum posts, they're providing their discoveries. Every new run that's a new record is submitted as, here is my claim for the fastest solution to this problem, and that's just kind of lets itself carry on run to run to run as we get better and better. So it already follows a very academic flow, but the ways in which we assess the artifacts that are like these solutions is not well defined. And that has been a shift historically from the SDA method of peer reviewing a run based on its overall quality into the more speedrun.com methods of being verified by one or two knowledgeable judges and then just providing it on the leaderboard.
I would say, so I work closely with SMW Central, and we're working on our process for how we're going to accept levels for our upcoming level design contest. And it looks fairly similar. One thing I think the academic world can learn a lot from the speedrunning world when it comes to peer review is transparency and the crowdsourcing of feedback from qualified reviewers. Yeah. So right now, a lot of the time when you submit something for peer review, you submit it anonymously, and it's either blind or double blind reviewed by a reviewer who doesn't know you or shouldn't know you, but also doesn't have to tell anyone that they're the one reviewing the work. And unless you go out of your way to share that work with others to get feedback, no one else is going to give you feedback on that paper. Whereas with us, at least, and I know it's pretty similar to how Task Videos does it. When you post something, it's fair game. Like you get feedback on it. The judges that are judging on it give feedback in a setting that is accessible and it is actionable, but also, let's say, transparent. You don't necessarily get that a lot. And the other thing is I think in terms of peer review for speedrunning, one of the things that is extremely important is that everyone needs to be on the same page when it comes to, rule sets, categories, stuff like that. We don't have that much of a problem in speedrunning because I think communities are pretty good about defining certain terms, certain definitions. There's an acceptable thing. Academics, not necessarily the case. Like, I could cite a theory or use a theoretical foundation for my paper, submit it, and a reviewer could say, no, I'm rejecting this paper because this theoretical foundation is used incredibly wrong. You're completely off base. This is totally not what this theory is about. And that's their opinion. That's their academic opinion.
It's happened to me.
Like, if I'm trying to explain to someone why I used this theory, and they come at me with, well, that's not what they meant. It's like if you come to me and say, hey, here's my speed run, and I'm like, no, you went out of bounds here. And you're like, no, I didn't. And you're like, well,
Playing as intended.
Looks like I'm the judge. Yeah. That happens in academia a lot.
I'm going to move on to the next question. I would love to talk to you more, but I think I have 2 more questions, and we're a bit short on time, so please.
Omni mentioned something earlier about how you shouldn't try and force speedrunning into things. It should just more emerge naturally. And it made me think of how often in speedrunning communities, developers will post and say either, how do I make my game speedrun friendly, or how do I design a game focused on speedrunning? To which the answer is almost always don't. So do any of you have any insight on why that kind of thing tends not to work out, or just the relationship between developers and speedrunners in general?
I do, and I think it's gonna be, it might be a weird way to think about it, but it's my personal opinion, and I think there are some people out there doing some really good work on it. This word isn't necessarily accepted in a lot of circles, but academically it is, and so I want to get that out there. But I believe that speedrunning is a queering of a video game, and I think there's a lot of opportunity to do some research into that. But ultimately, a speedrun is taking a video game and doing it in a way that was not intended to be done. And if a developer comes into it and is like, hey, I want to build a speedrun game, that's kind of not the point. Like, speedrunning exists as and I think you could do some work with queer theory on this. I do think it's a queering of video games in a way that it's not authentic to build a game for speedrunning, because speedrunning exists as a queering of video games in general. It's like I don't even know if there's an analogy I can make for it, or if you have any things like that. But building a game to speedrun it almost is antithetical to speedrunning. At least my interpretation of speedrunning in general. It's like trying to build antimatter. You don't necessarily, it doesn't really work well.
I'd say that build a game that you want to build, and the main goal is make it fun. If it's fun and it has options, people will enjoy it. Somebody's going to speedrun it. That's all you need to do. And there's things that you can do to make it more speedrun friendly, and there are developers who listen to this. So Shovel Knight's a good example of this. They listen to community feedback and, let's take some of these random elements that really don't serve a good game purpose, but would tremendously help speedrunners, and they reworked it so that it's much more consistent speedrun experience. That's the kind of thing that you want to try and support. You don't necessarily have to set out from the beginning saying this is going to be for speedrunners.
Yeah, something like an anti-splicing mechanism where during video review or help, put that in. We will love that. But in terms of the actual game design and the mechanics and the physics, I would say that's more of the gray area. But speedrun friendly and speedrun intended, I think, is two completely terms to think about.
Absolutely, because I think the problem that comes in is, as you were saying, speedrunning being a querying of regular gameplay. When you, as a developer, try and force your intentions on a game specifically with regards to the speedrun, then it becomes a problem, and it creates a lot of conflict with the speedrunners who are specifically, in some cases, trying to avoid the developer-intended experience of the game or even developer-intended paths and such.
It's like, think about your favorite speedrun that involves a zip or any kind of wall clipping, and imagine the developer trying to put that in their game on purpose. That's kind of what we're talking about here.
Okay, so the last thing that y'all mentioned was like speedrunning as content. So really what I want I think a question to pose would be, how is the interactive element of streaming within speedrunning different? How do social and parasocial relationships and that interactivity change the content? And like, what does that mediascape look like? How is that different? How do things change?
You just described my master's thesis.
You just described like 4 different papers I cited here. So.
A big part of it is the relationship that exists ultimately depends on what the uses and gratifications the person's trying to get out of it. I watch some speedrunners for very different reasons. I watch other speedrunners. I watch some people to make me laugh. I watch some people to enjoy their gameplay, even if I don't necessarily get a lot out of them as a personal, creator. The interesting thing that's happening is honestly what's happening almost outside of it, outside of Twitch as inside. Because what we're seeing is that these communities that form in Twitch chats are extending to places like Discord, and they're extending to other social media forums. And people, and this was my master's thesis, was the way that people are flowing back and forth between these channels seamlessly. Like you talk about something in Discord and then you go into Twitch chat and you keep the conversation going. Or vice versa, or a lot of times vice versa. If someone talks about something in Twitch chat and they're like, hey, let's move this conversation to a better platform for it. And those Discords a lot of them are individual centric, like Discords for your favorite streamers, but also they're community centric, like the speedrunning Discords or other game community Discords. And all of this is coming together to form at least as far as speedrunning goes, a very open mediascape where conversations are happening across multiple channels at the same time with a lot of the same people. And it's building a place where media no longer, like the conversations you have with people are starting to less and less matter where you're having them on. Like the conversations on Twitch, on Discord, on other forms of social media, you don't really have to think about it as much. Like, all right, I have to go log into my Discord now and I have to log into this. It's all happening simultaneously. And that's happening across media in general. It's not just happening in speedrunning, and it's not just happening in video games. But it's very easy to see in speedrunning because our community is relatively small, and you can see a lot easier people come up, people pop up in multiple places. If you've ever pulled someone up in Discord and checked mutual servers and realized that you're in like 12 servers together, you don't realize it until like you check. It's that kind of thing. We're getting to a place now where media is ubiquitous. And part of that will be speedrunning, because that's the media we're choosing to participate in.
And to quickly add, this is a wonderful example of what we meant by the research question, or your research interest in speedrunning has been answered in other areas. So your question on social relations and parasocial relations, there's been a lot of work done in my field in human-computer interaction on looking at live streaming from Periscope to Meerkat, which is other live streaming platforms, how that has changed social relations and social interactions, and the novel immediacy and immersiveness of live stream interactions. And there's so much work done looking at parasocial relationships that then you can look at how, okay, so this is everything that's been done on these different platforms in these different areas. How does speedrunning then fit into the existing conversation? How is it similar? How is it different? And what can we learn from this very specific case study? Because I can guarantee you, I can find 10 papers that talks about social and parasocial relationships between streamers and their viewers. And they view for a variety of different reasons. So that's kind of like the start, and then you kind of dive down this deep rabbit hole of saying, wow, there's so much work already being done. And if you want to take it one more step further, then you start looking at, then let's then see, what can we do? Let's read, let's discuss, let's see what new things we can discover. Yeah.
I think going forward, a big concept of both media studies and, frankly, human psychology in general is going to be about parasocial relationships, because with the rise of YouTube, there has been a lot of focus on the parasocial relationship, especially younger individuals are having with YouTubers. And I think every so often you see that interview or that article where someone's fan does something that makes a YouTuber or a streamer uncomfortable because they don't understand the difference between a social and a parasocial relationship. Yeah. And I think going forward, that's only going to get more pronounced. I don't want to say worse, but it's going to get more pronounced, and people are going to have more and more parasocial relationships that feel like social relationships because there's a chat room involved, and people aren't going to know what to do with that. And I think we're going to have to, as academics, but as society in general, come to terms with what happens when we have more parasocial relationships than we do actual social ones.
Do we have time for more questions?
It's not a question, it's more of a comment.
Yeah.
Sure.
This idea of the parasocial interactions, there is one Discord I joined 4 years ago, at the very beginning of everything, that I have watched a streamer grow and their Discord grow in opposite directions. The Discord has become perverse versus the streamer who is very prudish. Is that shift going to become more common? It was mostly me just adding that I've seen this interaction occur over my life. It worries me because I've seen members joining this community that are 13, 14, and 15. The very prime age that terrifies me as someone who is probably going to be looking heavily into child psychology of their growth.
I'm going to say something that's maybe controversial to some communities. I think it's the responsibility of the communities to look out for those people. I think that is an onus we are way too quick to just file under the, welp, you're young enough to know. I mean, we need to do more for them. And I think we need to do, some amongst us are better than others at recognizing and being self-aware about our status as internet people, whether that's a streamer or just another user on Discord. But I think more work needs to be done on the humanities end of the table on how this is affecting everything. And I think the humanities are going to be a lot slower to adopt this than some of the more engineering and computer science and UI, UX and human computer interaction side of things, because they're the ones that are going to be more familiar with the technological and the technical side of things. But we need more people like you in the humanities, because whether people realize it or not, those kids are going, I mean, more and more kids are joining these communities. And if they're lucky, they end up in a good one. Most aren't.
I hate to end it here, but I think we're out of time. Thank you for coming.
Does anyone have a happier question they want to end on?
But thank you everyone for coming and listening and having a great discussion. And if you want to stay after and talk, or if you see any of us for the rest of the event, feel free to stop one of us and continue the conversation. I think we're all very excited about all of this.
I do want to make a quick shout out. If you heard what Vi and I were talking about when it comes to querying the speedrunning as a querying of video games, twitch.tv/EdgeCase Collective. It's a group of people that are interested in academics, and they are applying this concept to speedrunning, to ROM hacking, and to a lot of other various speedrunning-centric topics. So they are doing some really good work. A lot of them are here. If you want to introduce yourself, I can introduce you to Leggy Starscream, who's involved with that, other members of the community that are here. So they're doing some great work. There are a lot of people doing great work out there in this, and there's a lot of us here that are interested in pushing this forward. And if you're interested in helping us push this forward, please, by all means, reach out and talk to us about it.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.